Hey friends, it's Emily Ruff here, founder of the Florida School of Holistic Living, and I'm tuning in today from Indakina, unceded territory of the Abenaki people, known in colonial names as Central Vermont. I'm up at the Sage Mountain Botanical Sanctuary, and in a few moments I'm going to be joined by my dear friend Nicholas Pearson, the Luminous Pearl, author of the Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden, a brand new book that's going to be coming out here any day now. Some folks who pre-ordered have already gotten their copy. And we are talking today all about flower essences. Nicholas and I are going to be sharing some of our experiences working with flower essences. We're going to be sharing some of the connections and relationships that flower essences have helped create in our life. And we're also going to be sharing some examples that we hope will be really actionable for y'all to help incorporate these, especially in this time that is really, for so many of us, feeling quite challenged and stressful. So I think Nicholas is tuning in here any minute now. Nicholas, if you can hear me, let me know. And we're just excited to have you here today. We're going to let folks gather, give a minute for Nicholas to get settled. And while we are waiting to get started officially, I invite you to grab a mug of tea or a glass of water, maybe a notepad or a pen, so that we can enjoy this time together. If you have any questions, feel free to jump on in with questions in the chat. We look forward to answering those. Definitely part of our conversation today, as much as it's about sharing some of the things that have been important to us, it's also going to be spending some time answering some questions that you all might have. So we look forward to chatting with you. Trying to get Nicholas in here. There we go. I think he's tuning in any minute now. Technical difficulties, especially with folks talking about flowers and herbs. It always takes a little minute. There he is. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you. My internet connection's a bit spotty today.
I understand that well. I'm going to turn mine up, make sure we're good here. So I was just sharing with folks that I'm tuning in today from Indakina, also known as Central Vermont, the unceded territory of the Abenaki people. And I did a little video about half an hour ago outside here at 2,500 feet elevation in Central Vermont. We just had a wicked blizzard roll through yesterday. We got about 3 feet of snow out there. So I'm feeling especially grateful to spend some time today talking to you about flowers and the earth and nature to brighten things up.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to be here with you, Emily.
Welcome. For folks that are tuning in, I want to give a little bit of introduction to Nicholas. So as I mentioned, Nicholas is author of Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden, which we'll be talking about more later on today. His latest in a series of books. Nicholas is a quite accomplished author. Many of his books are on topics such as Reiki and crystals. And Nicholas is based out of Orlando, Florida. And I first had the privilege of meeting Nicholas actually in one of my classes, Flower Essences for Emotional Health. But Nicholas is an incredible author, an incredible teacher, and I just wanted to invite him to share today kind of a conversation about these tools, flower essences, and to share with folks tuning in what flower essences are, for those of you that are totally new to these teachings and these practices, how these essences have been meaningful in our life, as well as some of the teachings that I share through my classes, Nicholas shares through his books, and hopefully send you all home with some real practical ways that you can incorporate these tools into your life. So before we jump into that, Nicholas, I just wonder if you want to take a moment to also introduce yourself or anything that's on your heart today, especially around flower essences or in general.
Sure. Thank you so much, Emily. So I've been a flower essence lover for a long time. I started with my introduction to the Bach remedies when I was in high school. I had a friend at the local metaphysical store who also practiced with flower essences and among the many things in her toolbox, and she thought they'd be an ideal ally for me as I went away to college. And I was really skeptical that this little dropper bottle was going to do anything for me, but man, oh man, was that like a bottle full of magic. So I was sold immediately. It's just this wonderful thing where you get such tangible results, often in short order. especially for the more acute stuff we've got going on in our psyche. And it was just absolutely wonderful. So some years later, I'd kind of fallen out of use with them, and eventually kind of thought I wanted to rediscover the magic of flowers and get to know the flowers in the Florida landscape. But with the onset of the pandemic in 2020, I thought it'd be a great time to kind of cocoon and do a lot more, we'll say, hard study rather than just self-study. And that's how I found your course. I mean, I'm obviously familiar with you and your work and the Florida School of Holistic Living. I'd seen the class cycle through a whole bunch of times, but I'd never really had an intimate introduction to the Bach remedies. So it was such a wonderful experience, and really fueled the writing process for the book too, which was being written at the same time. So yeah, the remedies are wonderful.
It's so wonderful, Nicholas. And we'll be talking about your book. I love it dearly. I can't wait for us to share it and for other students and friends of mine to get their hands on it. And I want to back up a little bit because I know some folks tuning in may not know what flower essences are or be curious, and that's why they're joining us today. And so what I have here is a little bottle of Bach Flower Rescue Remedy, which is probably the most recognizable flower essence. And to rewind even a little bit further, so flower essences are a remedy that are used for our emotional and mental and spiritual states, to help us get grounded and centered in ourselves and in the present moment, and address a whole number of specific emotions like anxiety or grief or anger or insecurity, or on and on and on. And my feeling about flower essences is that they're really a way that we can capture the magic of nature and put it in a little bottle and stick it in our pocket or stick it in our purse, right? We are, I think, so familiar with the feeling of peace and calm that we get when we step into a garden, or the just emotion that washes over us when we stop and smell a rose or see the beauty of a flower garden. But that's not something that we necessarily always have access to, especially folks that live in a city or are working in an office building or a hospital or a construction site, especially folks like myself living in a temperate climate where there's an expansive winter and the flowers are covered up with feet and feet of white stuff. It's a really nice way for us to connect back to the energy of the garden. And in the Western world, most of us are really aware of flower essences because of a practitioner named Dr. Edward Bach, or Dr. Edward Bach, who is based out of Wales, who was a student of homeopathy and took the essences from the flowers and diluted them according to the principles of homeopathy, and left us with what are these little bottles that we take a drop or two of today. Like you said, Nicholas, these little bottles are really, for those of us that have worked with them, somewhat of a little bottle of magic, I would say. I'm not sure if there's anything else that might be helpful for viewers tuning in that are totally brand new to flower essences to help kind of wrap our linear minds around these very non-linear remedies.
Yeah, in all my exposure to other writers and teachers and practitioners, we do our best to kind of clinicalize the work of flower essences. There's really robust data that shows they outperform placebos every time, and we haven't quite discovered what the mechanism is in a laboratory setting. So when we try to be really scientific, we come up with models for how they might work. We talk about things like the memory of water. Water is a really unusual substance. If we look at that very simple molecule, 2 hydrogen for every oxygen, the angles between its components are really malleable, which is unusual. If we combine any of the neighbors of hydrogen with water or with oxygen, we don't end up with a liquid like we do with water. We get volatile gases. So water is this almost impossible substance, and it's some of that impossibility, I think, that yields what we refer to as the memory of water. But we've still never actually observed it happening in situ under a microscope during the process of making an essence. We can't really say this is the clinical mechanism. But I have yet to meet a flower essence practitioner or user who's worked with them for long enough that doesn't also look at it from the perspective of plant consciousness. So perhaps there's something we store at a barely perceptible level energetically, maybe some sort of electromagnetic charge somewhere in the picowatt scale, like tiny, 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 tiny fractions of anything that we can measure. But even if we can't measure that, we do recognize that there's something about the intelligent force of nature that ends up in that bowl when we make our mother tincture, and through the process of dilution gets refined. It gets extended into our stock or dosage bottles, the two levels of dilution we use the most as flower essence practitioners. And I'm an animist at heart, so this concept really works for me. I believe in an inspirited universe. There's consciousness in everything with form, whether it's form that we can touch and see or form kind of out there in the ethers. So I really think that when we work with flower essences, it really is, like you said, this little bottle of nature. It's a cooperation with the inspirited part of nature. And that's what kind of works through the process of entrainment to remind us about what the feeling is of being in balance versus out of balance. They work a lot like tuning forks. If you use a tuning fork to tune a piano, it doesn't fix the piano for you, but by playing the correct pitch, you can make adjustments in the tension in that string and that wire until it's perfectly in tune. It's up for you to do the work, but the essence is the pitch being played in tune, so we know whether or not we're out of balance.
What an articulate analogy for how the essences work, because they're really, most of my students tuning in know that my father's a botany professor, so I especially appreciate conversations with folks like Nicholas that can dance between the worlds of science and spirit. And when I was first introduced to flower essences, it really required me to suspend a little bit of disbelief to try to understand and articulate how they work. But the experiential experience that I was having was definitely impactful for me, and I knew that it was far more than placebo. And like you referenced, there are numerous studies that have shown statistically significant impact that these essences have beyond placebo. We can't necessarily answer why, but we see that it is happening. And so I really appreciate this analogy of the tuning fork. I think that, giving ourselves this sort of, for, use of a kind of colloquial pop term these days, microdose of that essence, that frequency of nature to help us attune or entrain to that, I think is really a great way to explain how these essences are working. They are working on the subtle emotional level. It's not a freight train that's knocking us over and sedating us or stimulating us or, modifying our self. In fact, I think if anything, it's just sort of refining us more to our true nature. So I think that tuning fork analogy is really, really perfect. And I think it's helpful for folks that are new to flower essences that are tuned in today to also know that as we talk about these remedies, because they are homeopathic in their dilution, because they are subtle in their nature, and because they are, prepared in this way that's really emphasizing their energetic principles more than their phytochemical constituents, they are broadly safe for use no matter the physical health or emotional health condition we might be facing, no matter the pharmaceutical we might be taking concurrently. As an herbalist, as a clinical herbalist, I have a very limited toolbox that I can work with folks who are already taking a psychiatric pharmaceutical, an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety, because there are so many phytochemical and constituent interactions possible there. But flower essences, we are working solely in this sort of energetic realm, so it is safe for us to use them. I've used them at birth, I've used them in hospice, and a lot of places where even some of my gentle herbs like chamomile I wouldn't be able to use. So I think that's helpful to know. And I think that in thinking about flower essences, Nicholas, I was thinking about really sort of the two different ways that I work with them that I might call acute or chronic. And acute being like, I've turned on the news and I'm watching some horrific thing taking place in the world and I'm feeling the flutter in my chest, or I'm feeling the, tension or constriction in my body. And I use something like Rescue Remedy to sort of bring me back to center. Or a great example, I'm getting all my wires and gadgets set up to do an Instagram live with my friend about flower essences, and I'm feeling a little nervous and stage fright, so I'm taking a couple drops to kind of get myself back into a more calm, centered, comfortable place. That I think of like my acute use of the essences, but there's also what I think of as maybe a chronic essence strategy for things like longer term anxiety or grief or challenges in a relationship with another person or with my job, or some of these sort of longer term things that I can use the essences more in, I don't know, like a prophylactic way, so to speak. And so I wonder if you'd be willing to share a little bit about when you were using them in college, or any other instance, an example that maybe we could kind of relate to our audience, some of the ways that we've worked with these and how they've helped us.
Oh yeah, big time. So I really love that we've got the kind of two-pronged approach there. Every mixture that my friend Rita gave to me always had Rescue Remedy in it, so I could just have pre-packed an ally for those acute moments of anxiety. I went to school initially as a musician, as a music major, and there's this immense amount of pressure to literally perform in public, on stage, in front of strangers, and to do all these things that had never been part of my repertoire before. So as I also was diagnosed with a budding anxiety disorder that had probably been around for years, just unnoticed until it came to a head in that really transitional period, having those tools that I needed for the acute moments was wonderful. But I also worked with a lot of essences that dealt with my long-term experiences of those repetitive thoughts, like white chestnut, the little worries that are just always there, the tape you play in your head. I worked with walnut for the years that I was in college, which is the essence we associate with, maybe we could say, transition, adaptation. It's protective to a certain extent as well. And those were things that helped me. Every cycle of moving back home and then subsequently back to college was easier and easier. One, there's familiarity. It's a rhythm you get into, but I think the essences long term really, really helped me with that. And over the course of the years, my anxiety disorder came down quite a lot, from having all these really intense flare-ups to fewer and fewer with every passing month. And certainly essences weren't the only tool in my toolbox. I was taking the allopathic route. I was practicing other spiritual tools in my toolbox, but having something with me that could give me immediate relief, and then having something I could work with to kind of expose, to lay bare the underlying mechanisms, was really helpful for me too. And it was like every few months we'd refresh what was in the bottle so we could, see what was happening as we peel back the layer of the onion. Oh, well, maybe I'm done with this essence. Maybe I've been working with it for 6 months and there's really something underneath that other state. And since we've harmonized the state, we can go a little deeper. So the longer we work with them, it's as if we get to know ourselves better. That was one of the things I really appreciated about your class. Working through the 7 categories that Dr. Bach grouped his essences into, and really getting to see how they compared to one another, helped me understand myself, because I thought about the ways in which those 38 remedies have manifested in my own life or in the lives of people around me. And it helped me think about my own behaviors, my own beliefs, my own psychological makeup, what was going on inside my head and in my heart. And working with the remedies, because they're tuning forks, they show us what's out of tune, what's out of balance. And that's something we really only get with the long-term, the chronic use.
Absolutely. I tend to start out those classes by telling students that somewhat of a side effect of being a part of my course is not that you're just going to know about these flower essences at the end of our 5 weeks together, but you're going to develop first emotional awareness, being able to see our emotions, to know that we're experiencing them. I mean, that's such a skill that we aren't usually equipped with in our, younger years of schooling and being raised up, is just to, like, when you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling stress, tension, sadness, anger, to be able to know that you're feeling that and not just be in the throes of it and operating and reacting from it. And then after that awareness, the articulation of those emotions, being able to name them, to first know them, and then to name them, because, we can say we're stressed, we can say we're angry, but there's so many different colors of anger. There's so many different flavors of sadness, and really to be able to articulate more precisely and eloquently what specific emotion we're feeling helps us to then acknowledge it and address it, which then comes to like the third piece of that emotional journey, which is emotional maturity, to know it, to name it, and then to be able to respond rather than react, which is certainly something that using the essences long term gives us that support to do. It's not just something that we sort of overnight just suddenly are these highly evolved, emotional, transformed beings that never react to a trigger in our life. But if we're able to see that emotion and give it a name, then we can hopefully move more quickly into a state where we can respond to it a little more gracefully. And those, experiences that you mentioned are so commonplace in college transition pressure, and to have the ally of flower essences with you through that is something that I know I certainly wish I had had when I was in college. And one of the essences that you spoke of, white chestnut, was one of the early essences in my own personal study and learning with these herbs that really impacted me. I consider myself a sort of a lifelong worrywart. I think I come by it honestly. I come from a long line of worrywarts, my grandmother in particular. And when we're in that state of worry, I remember a teacher saying one time to me that worry is praying for what we don't want, and sort of allowing that hamster wheel in our mind to fixate on the things that haven't yet happened, but we are, concerned, we're worried, we're sort of putting our energy there. And one place white chestnut really was helpful for me in my 20s was I had ongoing sleep issues and would take a litany of herbs and breath work and all these different practices to try to help myself foster better sleep habits at night. And white chestnut flower essence was really a turning point for me because it allowed me to quiet my mind. What I realized in working with the essences is that it wasn't really my body that was still awake and charged up and excited. It was my mind talking to myself as I was trying to go to bed. And so white chestnut was something that really helped me quiet my mind, put down my list for tomorrow, put aside my things I wished I had done differently in that day, and just allow my brain to be quiet so that I could get some rest. And I began to apply that essence in other places, like going to a meditation session or going to a yoga class. And was just famous for sitting in a meditation session and like talking to myself in my head the whole time. And using white chestnut in particular was something that really helped me quiet my mind so I could achieve the benefits and get those blessings of sitting in a meditative practice. And so that's when that, I think a lot of folks probably used and leaned on in these last few years. There are a lot of things to rumble about in our monkey minds, and quieting that chatter, I think, really helps us be more present and address things at hand. And you also mentioned walnut, which was one that I used a lot myself, and also with a lot of my clients, especially in the spring of 2020 as the pandemic was first upon us. And we were, all of us, in this constant state of change and transition, whether it was losing our job or moving to working remotely or moving the kids to schooling at home or whatever the case. There was just all this change happening all at once, collectively, aside from any personal transitions that we were going through. And walnut, for me, just helps us find some ease and grace in transition. There's sort of this constancy of change that's a part of being human on this planet all the time, 24/7, but to be able to move through it and allow it and let it flow and not be resistant to it, which can only make that transition a little bit harder sometimes. So that's, I think, another one that was really probably widely used in the last few years for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I'm thinking also when we think about flower essences, and as we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, they sort of allow us to capture that intelligence of nature and carry it around with us. And for me, I know something that you and I have talked about is thinking about flower essences and helping to support connection and relationship, both to our self, our true self, our highest self, if you want to think about it like that, but also to the earth and to nature. And especially, a lot of us come to flower essences in a clinical approach, but we can't ignore this sort of subtle spiritual connection that the flowers engender. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about how that has played out for you and your experience with the essences, and in your study and work with the essences, that sort of sense of relationship or connection.
Sure. Thank you so much for asking. Um, the real light bulb for me started with getting to know the plants in my landscape. I had the kind of relational experience that something kind of mystical was happening when I shook the dropper bottle and put a few drops in my mouth, and something calmed down. I felt something happening, and that was a nice measurable end result. But really getting to see the process involved helped me understand maybe what's more than just the mechanism of the end result. And it was out in nature, just trying to find the very first flower essence I was ever going to make. And it was like I kept getting this strong feeling in the pit of my stomach every time I'd go to cut a flower that it didn't want to be involved in this process. I'm like, okay, maybe I have to let go of my expectations here. I had a list. I wanted to make this one, and then I wanted to make this one, and I wanted to make that one. And so I instead just let myself wander. And when I came upon this field of sand blackberry in this just resplendent bloom, totally unexpected, it's like, this is it. And so I'm already kind of sunbaked, and I'm very fair skinned. I don't do the Florida heat super well in full sun, but here we are anyway, wandering for an hour just to find one plant that felt willing to participate. And so I started that process, and immediately it was like being enveloped by the intelligence of this plant, of this flower, being welcomed into the fold, almost as if those brambles had taken hold of my senses to bring me into alignment with it. And it was just this moment of really decisive action. And much later, I'd find out that blackberry essence is often associated with things like when you have trouble manifesting, if you are hard to get from the mental idea into the concrete action. It's really good for cycles of indecision. And so like here was this moment of really decisive decision making of which flower it was going to be after wandering all morning. And it was as if the spirit of the plant had orchestrated that whole thing. It needed me to go through the list of things that weren't going to happen. And so that helped me kind of pursue the more relational side of working with flowers. And so one of my practices when I get a commercially prepared bottle of an essence I don't know, or if I want to make an essence from a flower that I'm not familiar with, is sitting down and kind of attuning to it. It's holding space for the heart of the plant to speak to my own heart. And speaking doesn't usually happen in words. It often doesn't happen in concrete symbols either. It is a very feeling kind of thing. And the sort of imaginal space you have to get into, you have to be really open to whatever is going to be and whatever is going to happen outside of the box, is where that deeper connection is forged. And there are certain plants that just, you feel it immediately. I think there are certain essences that are here to help us forge that better relationship with nature. Some of the ones that come to mind are things like lilac. Lilac has a good reputation of linking the human psyche to the psyche of nature, or to nature spirits or devas, or whatever words or symbols we use to kind of relate to that other world that is our world. I also like to think of foxglove as being a great one for this. Foxglove has a lot of folklore that associates it with nature spirits and fairies and other things. It's got a long connection in the sort of folkloric record of connecting us to the other world. And as an essence, it really is about this kind of alignment. We see, it's the stereotype of biennial. It's got that basal rosette of leaves that spread and spread for a good year or so, and in the second year it sends up this tall spike, this tall inflorescence. And it's got that kind of verticality to it brings in a sense of alignment. And the thing it's aligning us to is the world around us and our true self. You know, those two things are hand in hand because we are not separate from nature. Even here in my office, everything around me came from nature. Maybe it's been processed 3 or 4 degrees of separation away, maybe a dozen degrees of separation, but it's all nature. We are nature. If the bird's nest is nature, why isn't our skyscraper? We put ourselves in a different box. And I think some of these flowers remind us of that very easily, and others might work on other things, but there are definitely some flowers that are giving me that really strong connection of forging a relational process. It's not just a clinical, if I put a few drops of this under my tongue, I get an effect. Yes, that happens, but why and how? And as we hold space for that, as we really kind of tap into the depth of mystery that the essences offer, there's a different kind of change that happens, more than just the psychological kind of list of therapeutic indications that we're trying to overcome. You know, what is the negative state and how do we get to the more harmonious one? But like, how do we partner with this intelligence? How do we open our hearts to the unconditional love that nature has for us that we don't always have for ourselves? And when we can sit in that, that's where the biggest healing happens. And it's very nonlinear, very, very nonlinear.
Well, and I think that it is something that we, especially those of us living in cities, are so disconnected from that, and we are generationally disconnected from that relationship and that animism in a lot of different ways, and it, you know, expresses itself in so many different forms of disconnect in our, you know, waking life. But like you said, the essences, you know, far beyond their therapeutic indication, are really reestablishing that connection and reestablishing that relationship. And I think my experience has been that this is happening in a way that certainly isn't conscious. And I have so many clients who came to me for, you know, something weird growing on their toe, or I don't know, something very physical in nature. And at the end of our, you know, time together, I send them home with an essence, and they certainly have not taken into consideration any of, you know, this type of conversation like we're having right now. But after working with essences for some time, it just sort of is this subtle transformation that's taking place at that, you know, level of sort of ancestral DNA remembrance. Like it's sort of turning on these switches again that have long been turned off by our society, and helping us be more open to this concept, be more open to inviting in that relationship and accepting that connection and allowing that connection. I mean, I've certainly seen that in clients who are open and embracing to this type of thing, but especially in those that, like, this is nowhere in their awareness, and yet they're, you know, here they are noticing a plant or noticing a tree or noticing, you know, a flower, or noticing something in themselves in a different way that I, you know, can only attribute to the flowers working in that emotional and spiritual realm. And, you know, like I said, kind of lighting up those extra sensory points perhaps in our consciousness and in our awareness that, you know, our ancestors, and it's been well documented all over the world, people having and using these forms of communication and relationship to move through the world, you know, cosmology, health, like, you know, people have intimately been in relationship with nature as long as we can document, and we've just sort of more historically recently fallen out of that. So we're just, you know, picking that back up, turning that back on, I think. And I think your story about the sand blackberry is just a perfect example of that in action, you know, just really, I love, you know, that the indications for it were for indecision and decisiveness, and here you had that experience of being so concrete. I've seen that so many times. I was thinking about in the spring of 2020, I lost my father quite suddenly, and as I was preparing to travel to go be with family and deal with, you know, the things you do after that, I found this small little blue flower in the yard that was just beckoning me to sit with it. And I, you know, had moved to this ecosystem fairly recently. So there's a lot of plants that I know here from visiting here for the last 20 years, but there's still so many of them, especially in the early spring season, that are still very new to me. And I didn't know this plant, and I just, it was really beckoning me to sit with it. And after several hours of just sort of sitting and communing and being with this plant, I made a flower essence. And later that day, a friend stopped by, and I just was feeling so pulled and tugged to this plant. I said, "What is this plant over here?" And it was the flower Forget Me Not, which just in that moment really spoke so much to my connection to my father and his journey, and just, you know, all these things wrapped up into each other. And I found again and again that folks like you and I, and stories like Blackberry and Forget Me Not, are just repeated over and over. And to encourage and allow ourselves to be open to those allows them to be more a part of our experience, and more clear communication coming from nature. And certainly I think in my own life, my linear science background was really opened up just by working with the flower essences, allowed me to have less resistance to seeing that animism and making those connections. And you know, a kind of a final thought on that, Nicholas, is I've long felt, far before the isolation of the pandemic, and definitely since these last few years, that one of the reasons that we in this culture in the West experience so much anxiety and depression is largely due to our disconnection from our relationship with nature. And, you know, we think about, we're going to take a walk in the woods alone. Well, we're not really alone. We're surrounded by all these beings and all this intelligence and all these creatures. And I've long felt like reestablishing that relationship with nature is one way that we can feel less isolated as we move through the world. And especially in the last 2 years, where there's been so much acute isolation because of the pandemic, I felt it's even more of an important medicine to weave back into our life. And so I'm personally very grateful that in this time I've had the flower essences to help remind me of that connection, and to sort of correct that sort of, Joanna Macy uses the term, and others do too, the great forgetting, like sort of to remember that we are connected, remember that relationship as a part of the healing. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. Well, I want to also invite folks that are tuned in, if you have any questions. I'm sure Nicholas and I can just wax poetic all day long about these remedies, as they've been so important for us and those we love and those we teach and those we work with. But I want to invite you to share any questions that you have in the chat. And I also, you know, want to think about what are some, Nicholas, maybe we can both share some examples or practices that we might be able to share with folks tuning in, some sort of actionable, tangible things that they can take home from this conversation to think about ways that they can weave flower essences into the challenges that they're experiencing. So I wonder if there are any, like when someone comes to you and is new to this work, is there like a standard kind of tip or tool that you like to leave with folks?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, it's know thyself. If we can't put words to what we're experiencing, it's really hard to translate that to the thousands of different essence options that are available from just as many different makers. So a good amount of quiet self-reflection is really helpful. And when all else fails, in the box system, you can start with Wild Oat, and it'll assist that process of self-reflection and really kind of help you find the direction you're leaning in. But even if you just kind of aim in the right direction, you might not have the exact words figured out, but you know, if you are fearful, start with essences for fear. If you are, you know, kind of numb, apathetic, disconnected from the world around you, from what's been going on, and it's crisis after crisis after crisis. Yeah, I've heard this referred to kind of poetically as the tower times. If we use the tarot as our symbolism, big shifts, big things crumbling. So, you know, find essences that relate to that feeling of uncertainty. And even if you don't quite get it, the great thing about flower essences is nearly all of the time, the absolute worst thing that happens if you get it wrong is nothing at all. So don't be afraid to do a little trial and error, and talk to people. If self-reflection is not your jam, like talk to a friend and just talk out your problems and jot down some notes and see what comes from that. And, the great thing about the Bach remedies, there's only 38 of them. It's a pretty complete system. You sometimes have to get creative and mix and match to paint the full picture of what you've got going on in your psyche, but there are so many other essences that are available to you. So if you're not a flower essence maker, if you don't feel really called to do that, start with what is most accessible. And a little bottle of Rescue Remedy is a great way to go. But everything can be built on that kind of self-reflection piece.
That's the root of it, Nicholas. That's it. And I think I really appreciate you reminding folks that if it's not in your nature to just sit and self-reflect, which is a practice in and of itself and all to its own, then soundboarding with a friend or writing some things out in a journal. Those are two ways that we can sort of self-reflect with assistance and with some support and with some help. And certainly the beautiful thing about flower essences is that because they are non-toxic, because they are so safe, we can experiment liberally and not necessarily get it perfectly spot on, but not cause harm by doing that either. I know that you and I both are passionate about working with bioregional plants in our medicine, and as well as in your book covering so many different wonderful plants from the witch's apothecary that are some within the Bach system, but a lot of them outside of that system. And at the same time, I appreciate you calling that system in, because that is the 38 essences that most people will find at an herb store, at a Whole Foods, at an apothecary, and can be somewhat accessible as a first step into this journey. And I think absolutely knowing what's going on is how we can then address it. And so that, emotional self-reflection, I think is really step one. And then for my recommendations for folks that are especially brand new to this and not really sure where to start, looking to a book like Nicholas's, looking to other resources is helpful, but also like Rescue Remedy is a great first step. I call it sort of emotional first aid. It's something that is in my car, in my purse, in my first aid kit proper. And when I'm myself when I'm so wound up or worked up about something that I can't really truly self-reflect and be very clear to articulate what's going on, I always look to Rescue Remedy to help calm me down enough that I can then think clearly enough to articulate what that emotion is. And I have really valued using this tool because it is so widely accessible for folks and really, easy for people generally to find, even if they don't live in a particularly hip town that has 20 apothecaries. You can usually find it at a lot of even drugstores are carrying it now. And they also have different types, different forms of it. So these are little candies, pastille candies that I often tell my students several years ago when I was working at Standing Rock in the prayer encampments that were resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline. We couldn't use any alcohol-based remedies. So I brought a bunch of these Rescue Remedy candies to the camp, and I would, administer them, especially after times of police brutality and violence. And some of my dear friends who were often skeptical about my little remedies, but would, if the situation was dire enough, they would accept them. And these, Rescue Remedy pastilles were really helping folks unwind from the shock and trauma of some of those experiences. And these little candies were lovingly called hippie Xanax by some of my friends out there, and became this very endearing thing. They would follow me around camp and ask if I had some hippie Xanax for them. And while it is certainly not to conflate these tools with a tool like Xanax or Valium, at the same time, it does chill folks out. It does bring, unwind and bring people down. And so those candies can be great tools, sprays, so many different ways that Rescue Remedy is shared. So I think, if folks take home too, really kind of ideas about how they might integrate flower essences, I think being in reflection and reaching for a simple remedy first, like Rescue Remedy, is going to put you on a really good path towards discovering more about these and how they work. And once you start to work with something like Rescue Remedy or Wild Oat or White Chestnut, then I think, like you said earlier, we peel off the layers. We sort of work with like what's really in our face and at the forefront of our emotional struggle. And then as that calms down, we realize that there's all sorts of stuff that we can, start to work on beneath the surface of that. So
Absolutely.
yeah. I want to take a moment, Nicholas, to talk about your beautiful book. So here it is again. If you weren't tuned, and it might be backwards. Sorry. Yay! Aw, look, this is cute. Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden: Plant Spirits in Magical Herbalism. And this is a book that I shared in my review of the book. Is going to be a treasured reference in my library, and really fills a unique niche in the flower essence world in terms of resources, because there are so many wonderful books about Bach remedies and so many clinical books about non-Bach and Bach remedies. But I think really you fill a void for looking at other plants in the possibility of flower essences, but also help us really look at these as a larger system, and not just sort of myopically look at them at like, here's something clinical for the indication, but like you said, helping to really rebuild that relationship. And what I especially love about this book is the way that you bring folklore and energetic associations and planetary and zodiac signatures, and just have such a complete materia medica of the flowers. So mine is all, I've only had it a few weeks now. Mine's all dog-eared and highlighted, and I'm sure it will continue that way. So I think people can order it now, but I wondered if you'd just share a little bit more about how this book came to be and what you love about it, and how folks can get their hands on a copy.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. This book started as something completely unrelated. I was working on actually a line of flower essences from native Florida plants, which has never fully manifested. I have lots of mother tinctures stored carefully in jars and cabinets, but it's never felt like I wanted to make a commercial product out of it. But I had all these notes, and then I wanted to kind of explore other areas to understand the plants, because a lot of the natives that I was working with, there was no counterpart in other systems of flower essence therapy. Sometimes I could find a close relative or very distant relative, but occasionally I could find the same plant used in like folk magic here in the Americas. And maybe there'd be a little aha moment there that would inspire me to see a link between the folkloric use, the kind of picture painted by its doctrine of signatures, the gesture of the plant, the shape and color of its flower, and the other clues about its energetics there in its physical body. And then all of that would kind of steer me towards the direction of understanding the energy I felt or perceived, or the more clinical aspects of it. So I had this concept kind of stirring around in my head, but it wasn't until the pandemic was really in full swing that it just hit me like, why don't I write a book about this? I do weird things with flower essences that I don't see in other books. Mm-hmm. I use them not just in the clinical setting, but I've been incorporating them into meditation and ritual and other spiritual practices. Sometimes, you don't have a rare herb, or you just can't access something, or it just isn't convenient to sit there and grind root or bark in your mortar and pestle until you have a fine powder to add it to an incense or a candle. But a couple drops of flower essence give us that energetic infusion. They give us that link to the spirit or the consciousness of that plant. So we still get the same kind of magical or spiritual effects from it. But there was no handbook that really talked about this. And although I knew a lot of people in the occult and metaphysical and witchy kind of scenes who worked with essences, I didn't see a whole lot of crossover in terms of literature that taught us how to do these things together. So I was taking a shower one day, and then it dawned on me. It's like, okay, Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden. You have a title. Go write this book. So I did, quite unexpectedly. In the span of 9 months, right there in early 2020, I started. And 9 months later, I had this really meaty tome. It clocks in around 500 pages. And it's, by word count, the biggest book I've written, which is not a small pronouncement. I don't write small books. And it was just this really, really fun adventure for me. And having that crossover between the more clinical side and the more folkloric side, being able to draw in all of the other aspects that interest me about plants, kind of the same way I do with rocks. I like to keep a foot in the realm of science and spirituality at all times. Was just a lot of fun.
It is fun to read. It is fun to apply some of the teachings that you share in this book. And certainly, you identified a need and filled it. And it's something that I trust a lot of people are going to really appreciate. I love hearing about some of the ways that you apply flower essences, you know, and thinking about, like, yes, there are these therapeutic ways that we can work with them, but we can also work with them in these very magical ways in our meditation and in our rituals, and really weave them in. They fill all these different needs for us. And so it's really cool to hear you talk about that. And this is just a 492-page book full of magic and wisdom, and I'm so delighted to have it on my shelf and to share this with my students. So can folks, where's the best place for folks to pick up a copy for themselves?
Well, definitely if you've got a little indie bookstore near you, independent metaphysical store, that is a great place to get started. The official release date will be April 5th, although some pre-orders directly from my publisher have already started shipping. And I'm sure if your local shop doesn't have it, they'd be happy to order it for you. But of course, you can find it everywhere books are sold. You can visit my publisher's website, which is innertraditions.com, and order directly from them or from Amazon and Barnes & Noble and anywhere else, Books A Million. You can find it at target.com if you really wanted to. So whatever's going to be the most accessible option for you, you can do it that way. Request it in your local library. That's another option for you as well. And of course, there are ebooks available from anywhere that does ebooks. So the ebook is already out. It got its formal release date in February, but the physical book will be out here in North America April 5th, and the release date in the UK is March 12th.
April 5th and March 12th if you're tuning in from across the pond. Awesome. Well, I definitely encourage folks to run right out and get their copy if this conversation has been inspiring to you, especially if you have already dabbled in flower essences and want to think about broadening your approach and going deeper with the essences. That's really, I think, what this book is really beautiful for. So I also, just want to thank you, Nicholas, for taking those 9 months to pour your heart and soul into this book, because it's really a service to all of us in the flower essence and the herbal and the magic world to now have this as a resource. And I can't wait to share it with more of my students and my friends. And so speaking of students, you and I met. You were a student in my Flower Essences for Emotional Health class. And we did want to just let folks know that are tuned in that I'm offering that 5-week class again starting April the 12th. And there's information about it at the link in our bio or holisticlivingschool.org/flower essences. But it's a 5-week course that is rooted in the Bach flower system of 38 essences. We use the Bach Remedies workbook as the textbook, but we by no means limit ourselves to the Bach system. That system is a really beautiful, complete system and a great introduction if you're new to the essences, but we also spend some time talking about how to make your own flower essences, how to work with essences in your bioregion, work with essences outside of that system, work with many of the essences that you'll find in Nicholas's book, and leave feeling, like I said, not just an understanding of the essences, but also emotional awareness, emotional articulation, and emotional maturity. And there's some information about that class also in the link in our bio at the Holistic Living School Instagram. And I've also got a couple other videos if you are brand new to flower essences, but this has piqued your interest and you want to learn more. There's an essence about how to make your own, a video about how to make your own flower essences, which is something that I know Nicholas and I are both really proponents of working with the medicine hands-on. There are great companies you can get prepared essences from, but there's nothing quite like building that relationship in the land where you're living. And there's also a talk about flower essences for these challenging times, grief and trauma, and specifically outlining some essences, some of which we've spoken about today, like white chestnut or walnut, that can be particularly helpful through both the personal and collective grief and trauma that we're all moving through in this weird time. So I invite you to check out those resources. And if you're feeling called, join us for that upcoming class. Please follow the Luminous Pearl, Nicholas Pearson, on Instagram if you don't already, or Florida School of Holistic Living at Holistic Living School. And we will continue probably to carry on this conversation. I'm so grateful for you all tuning in today and sharing a bit of your Sunday afternoon with us. And Nicholas, especially, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your connection. I just feel Mother Earth really speaking through you in all of your books and teachings. And it's just wonderful, as always, to spend time with you today. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciated our chance to have this chat. Thank you, everyone watching, and definitely check out the class. I can't rave about it enough. I really enjoyed those 5 weeks. Our group was like the perfect little container to hold the magic of the plant kingdom, so we could really have those experiences of going deeper. So please, if you're watching, check it out.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. And thanks to everyone tuning in today. Hope that you stay safe and healthy, and that the flowers may be surrounding your heart and bringing you a little bit of peace in this crazy weird time. Sending much love. Many blessings, everyone.